I'm Professor John Hattendorf, the Professor Emeritus at the Naval War College. I formerly held the chair of maritime history here. I'm going to talk today about the USS Constellation. The ship was here in Newport from 1894 until 1946. It was a ship with a great controversy about it. Here, this is a model of the ship that you can see today in Baltimore Harbor. But that ship, which is the one that was here, was always claimed to be this ship, which is the 1797 frigate. That is a sloop of war, and this is a frigate. The sloop of war was built in between 1853 and 1855, and this, of course, in 1797 originally. There's a great controversy about it. Well, while it was here, the Navy tended to, I think, almost always argue that it was the original vessel. That was because it was here in terms of the recruit training station, and to give the recruits a sense of their history and heritage. To have one of the original 6 frigates here was a great advantage to the training in ships. It was also, of course, a sail training vessel, and they could run up and down the rigging and get some feel of what sailing ships were like in that period. The ship itself actually mainly was moored stationary here in Newport, though it did occasionally move. One of the reasons for the controversy was that this ship was built apparently without any direct congressional authorization, and the Navy built it saying that it was a repair rather than an original construction. So from the beginning there was an issue here about which ship it was. The controversy continues in 1945. Howard Chappell of the Smithsonian Institution published the first attempt to show that that vessel was not the original 1797 vessel. And then finally broke up into several books came out, several studies came out. The Navy resisted the identification for a long time. And then finally in the 1990s, it was pretty much agreed to, and the Navy changed its mind. The story behind this, it was even more complicated because in 1913, of course, the Woodrow Wilson government came in, and Under Secretary of the Navy Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was very interested in this period, the Navy was asked at that time to send a ship to Baltimore to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Star-Spangled Banner and the attack on Fort McHenry. So they chose Constellation, and Franklin Roosevelt, as Undersecretary or Assistant Secretary, what the title was in those days, had it redone at New York Navy Yard, and with orders to change the deck arrangement so it looks like the 1797 vessel. Well, that further complicated the issue, and so the controversy continued. In the 1980s or 90s, I guess it was, the Baltimore Harbor was redesigned, and the architect for that redesign was a man by the name of Thomas Todd, who lived here in Jamestown, Rhode Island. And he was so fascinated by this story that he built this terrific model here, which won several awards in competitions, model competitions. And this, of course, is of the first vessel, the frigate. An incredible amount of research on it. I remember he told me something like 14,000 hours went into it. Tremendous amount of research on what the vessel would look like, what the stern look like. The stern, of course, the whole stern issue, there's quite a difference between the stern of that vessel and this vessel. And that was one of the early points of controversy in here. But a detailed look at this model, for example, will show you all the sailors' hammocks here. And there's a couple of, an older couple of my age here looking at the situation. And Captain chewing out a young sailor on the quarterdeck. So they great detail for this model. All the guns, everything handmade. Each of the pieces of copper separate and hand put on. So it's a beautiful model and a great addition to our collection here, and really illustrates the difference between these two vessels. So I think I'm going to ask some questions.
Sure. Yeah, on the subject of the differences between them, can you tell us a little bit just about what the differences are sort of in the mission and function of an 18th century frigate and a 19th century sloop of war?
Well, this of course being well, I'm not sure how you exactly define that, but the design of the two vessels are different. The hull design is different. Certainly the stern design is different, and you can see the areas here. The frigate would be a fast vessel for combat, sloop of war, kind of modified thing in the later 19th century. Those functions had changed a bit, so the title changed. She was used, for example, in the slavery patrol. She was used various things. She was. This vessel was involved in the War of 1812, and so there's a difference of function and actual usage of it from that point of view. Later, of course, a similar hull design was developed into the steam frigate that was used here. But this is a significant vessel in the fact that it was the last full sailing vessel built for the United States Navy. That's a significant marker in the history of warships, and a good reason to save the vessel, not to throw it away or have it scrapped in Baltimore.
And once the sloop is here, of course, it's used as a training ship, as you mentioned, and the apprentice training program that is kind of closely connected to it. Can you talk a little bit about that training program?
Sure.
How the ship was used as a training vessel?
And there was another use for the vessel as well. It was during World War II. It was the backup flagship of the Commander-in-Chief Atlantic Fleet, and it was also a backup communications station. Thinking that no German enemy ship would think that there'd be a radio station on board the wooden warship. So that was a good idea. The Commander-in-Chief of the Fleet, Admiral Ingersoll, and others did come as kind of a backup ceremonial flagship. It was here, but most of the time it had been being used by the recruits. They could sort of get the feel of what a real ship was like. There was land-based in the barracks here in Newport, and they could use this for training and be on board for learning how to tie knots and do all sorts of things of that nature, or even going up in the rigging. I don't know if they actually set sails or not, but they were actually doing that sort of thing, and it was here as a kind of, so they were, and I know there were ceremonial events that took place on board. We had sometimes the president of the Naval War College was here, Admiral Spruance. There's a picture of Admiral Spruance on board on the wheel of the vessel. So there are all kinds of interesting things that went on as a kind of iconic vessel here in Newport.
Besides knot tying and setting the sails, do we know of any other specific skills they were trying to teach them on board the ship when it was used as a training?
I don't know
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of like the timeline is you know, into the early 1900s, it's still being used for that purpose, and of course by then I don't think the Navy is really concerned about sailors learning sailing ship-specific skills. So why do you think that they were still incorporating that as part of the training?
Well, I
even
mean,
without
there's still the
leaving?
argument for sail training ships today to use, well, the Coast Guard, we still have Eagle, and the Coast Guard is to get the feel of, it's the best way you can understand how a ship moves and how the elements affect the ship by actually having a sail power behind it. I know as a young naval officer, I'd done a lot of sailing as a teenager and a young 20-year-old, and I used my experience as a sailor in ship handling of destroyer in the 1960s and 70s.
Wow. You wouldn't think that would translate over so well, but it would, did, huh?
I knew how to use the wind on the hull to maneuver the ship once in a critical moment when my ship was in Bermuda.
That sounds like a whole separate interview, actually. We want to get that story too. Have you come across any, diaries, letters, any personal stories of people who were on the ship as a training vessel?
I have not, and that would be a good thing to try to search out. I've not heard of that. There's similar things like that. They've found tremendous things with in relation to Constitution in Boston and in the museum up there. But I don't think anybody's really looked for these areas, so that's an open area for research.
With the whole controversy about the identity of the ship, why do you think there was so much interest and so much passion around trying to show that it was the original frigate?
One of the reasons is that people were trying to favor this ship is because she's actually a few weeks older than Constitution. She was originally rated as a 38 or 36 gun ship, and the Constitution was a 44 gun ship. And of the 6 frigates, there were 3 of each type that were being built in the 70s. So to have one example of each one was one of the motivations behind it. And the people here, of course, were saying, well, we have the older ship, and that's a newer one up in Boston. So that was sort of part of the local rivalry to do that.
And the museum's parent command, Naval History and Heritage Command, or the Naval Historical Center, as it was known back in those days. Can you tell us a little bit just about their role and the whole controversy and then the plans?
Yeah, well, they were very much behind the idea that this was the original vessel. At one point when I was serving there as a lieutenant, in those days it was even before that, it was called the Naval History Division of the Office of Chief Naval Operations back in the I served there from 1967 to 1969 as a lieutenant. One of my jobs was as the top secret control officer, and when I took over the job, of course, as you do, you inventory everything in the safe. It was a huge, great big, huge, double-door, ancient safe in the main Navy building on Constitution Avenue in Washington, and I was struck because I found these mid-19th century logbooks in there, and I said, well, what are these? And so I went into the Admiral and said, Admiral, I found these seem to be misplaced in the top secret control office. And he said, oh no, you keep those quiet and don't you let anybody into those logs. Those are the logs of the Gosport shipyard that show that this was a later built ship. So we want to make sure that people believe that this is the original 1797 vessel.
So did he actually say that? He said that these do show it was the later ship?
Yes, I was
admitted
told that, and I was told not to tell anybody. So he may come down and hit me with lightning. But he was a great one for the tradition and showing that. And yeah, I think he was from Maryland and wanted to show that Baltimore had the original vessel, and the USS Constellation Foundation was very much, there was a big political fight going on at the time as to what the vessel was. And there's all sorts of things going on with this. I mean, there was times they claimed that, it was a false claim that the War College Museum in the 1920s had a huge documentary collection of these things, and that the museum had burned down and these documents had disappeared. None of that is true. They were supposedly original documents that had been owned by Teddy Roosevelt. And this collection has never been known by anybody else, never been found. The museum, of course, the War College collection, Naval War College Museum collection wasn't established by CNO until the 1950s. So that was complete smoke and mirrors kind of thing. But that's the kind of arguments that were being made, a lot of false information, some going on, and people arguing one way or the other. But finally, I think resolved, although it was really resolved in the 1990s after several reports were written on it. But as late as 2003, another book was published claiming that they are really the same vessel. So it still continues to be.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. And NHHC and the Navy, of course, recognize it as the second ship. But are there any other significant groups out there, to your knowledge, that still claim it's the
I haven't heard
frigate?
anything recently about it, but beyond this 2003 book that the Naval Institute published. And that was, so.
Was it controversial for them to publish it at that point, or?
I'm sure it was
Yeah.
at that point, adding to it, but it was a full book-length study of the vessels. And then in the 1990s, the Chappelle Report was done, and he had mentioned it in his book on the history of the sailing Navy. It came out in 1945, and then he was constantly on this point. I remember going to talk with Chappelle, and it was one of the topics he told me about as a young lieutenant when I went to visit him in this business when I was attached to the Naval History Division.
Yeah, I've read some of the reports even to the point where unfortunately there was an employee there that was caught kind of making false artifacts or manufactured artifacts and planting them on the ship. Did you come across any of those stories about?
There was one about it was apparently a false document was put into a file here at the Naval War College Library that talked about I've never really tried to figure it out, but there was a man who had served in the vessel and was around at the time that this vessel was built, and he left a report that it was the same vessel, it wasn't a new vessel, and at the time he died, which was about 1920s, they presumably lowered the flag in his honor on board the ship, and there was a draft document in the War College records saying that this as a draft order to have that flag brought down. But that people have later said that was a false document that somebody slipped in later. So there's all kinds of shady things going on.
I'm glad you mentioned too about World War II and its use as a radio station and as a flagship, as Admiral King's flagship. To the best of our knowledge, though, Admiral King was never on board. He didn't actually come here, did he?
He may have. I mean, he was here as Commander-in-Chief Atlantic in his flagship Augusta, and he was around town. He may have visited it. We don't have any. I've never seen a photograph of him being here, but his successor, Admiral Ingersoll, was on board and did come for occasional ceremony. And there, I think we have in a collection some photos of that. Here, and I know, as I said, Admiral Spruance, just about the time he was leaving here in 1948, has a picture taken on board, just about the time the vessel was being removed.
And do you know about how big, like, the crew of the ship would have been? Would it have been just like a skeleton caretaker?
It was a skeleton
crew
here, and the idea was that the recruits would be here. And of course, later during the war, things changed. We weren't doing pure recruit training. We were doing ship training for ship companies. So that was a little bit different. That's why the function of the ship changes during World War II to be a radio station and a backup flagship. Anything else?
What do you think? Is that enough, or?
I think we've got plenty to work with, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that covers all the major topics.
Okay, yeah, nothing else about the Constellation in Newport specifically, of various places it went, or functions it had specifically here?
Well, I guess, yeah, we could talk about a little, it was down at that dock and then behind Barracks B for a while. Can you tell us a little bit just about the moving around?
It did move around on the piers here on Coasters Harbor Island and in Coasters Harbor here at the end of the pier. Someone was at the end of the pier. Then for a time, there was in front of Barracks B, which is a kind of a symbol on the other side where the big barracks that burned down. There was a jetty built out there, and the ship was, at least for a time, left out there. I've seen it, I think we have a photograph of that. But that was also used as a for coal barges to come in and feed the steam heating plant in here. So I don't know that that was ever planned as a long-term mooring for her. Most of the time you see pictures of her which are down sort of crossways at the end of the pier down here at the bottom of in the harbor and the marina here.
And actually, since we're talking about anchors, that's the topic of the day with this, do you think any of the training that they would have done on the sloop, would they have had them, hauling up the anchors as like a training exercise, or would they not have handled the anchors at all?
They could have. I don't know. I've never seen any of that. I suspect that the older anchors were in, say, the 1914 or 1913-14 period when they were making the ship look more like an 18th century vessel was when those older anchors were put on board. Because there was at one time the vessel had a kind of conning deck that was put in the back, and that was taken off at this time. And then they used the deck, sort of inspired by the deck arrangement that the original 1797 vessel had. So that's when you get those changes.
Okay, I think that's probably good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, okay.